They say grief is a heavy burden, but for my siblings, it was nothing more than an anchor they couldn't wait to cut loose. While the tea in my mother's favorite porcelain cup was still warm, they were already in the hallway, slapping price tags on her soul and arguing over the silver. They didn't see a matriarch who had sacrificed everything. They saw a catalog of items to be liquidated before the sun went down. My brother had a realtor on the phone before the paramedics had even cleared the driveway, and my sister was already peeling the rings off fingers that had nurtured us both. They thought they were selling furniture, but they were actually selling the only thing that kept this family from falling into the abyss. You think you know the people you grew up with until there is a scent of inheritance in the air and the masks finally slip. My name is Janet, and this is my story. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heartwarming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. And drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable. Happy listening. The silence in my mother's house had always been a sacred thing, filled with the smell of lavender and the ticking of the grandfather clock that had survived 3 generations. But that afternoon, the silence was shattered by the sound of packing tape and the cold, rhythmic clicking of a calculator. I sat on the velvet sofa, my hands trembling in my lap, watching my brother Marcus and my sister Elena move through the living room like vultures. There was no prayer, there was no moment of reflection. My mother had passed away only 4 hours prior, yet the house felt like a crime scene where the evidence was being erased for profit. Marcus stood by the fireplace, pointing at the antique mantel clock, the one our grandfather had carried across the ocean. He didn't mention the history, he only mentioned the market value. Elena was even worse, hovering over the jewelry box with a magnifying glass she had brought in her purse, as if she had been preparing for this day for years. I felt a coldness radiating from them that was sharper than the winter air outside. Every time they touched an object, it felt like a violation. They were stripping the walls of our childhood, turning every memory into a transaction. I tried to speak, to tell them to stop, to remind them that our mother's body hadn't even reached the funeral home yet, but the words caught in my throat. I realized then that I wasn't just losing a mother. I was realizing that the siblings I loved were strangers driven by a greed so deep, it had completely hollowed them out. The betrayal was just beginning, and the secret they were trying to hide behind their frantic haste was far darker than a simple dispute over furniture. The sound of Marcus dragging a heavy trunk across the hardwood floor screeched like a scream in the quiet house, a sound that grated against my nerves until I felt I might break. He didn't care about the scratches he was leaving on the floor our mother had polished every Saturday for 40 years. To him, this house was no longer a home. It was a shell waiting to be emptied and discarded. I watched as Elena reached for a small, hand-painted ceramic bird that sat on the windowsill, a gift I had saved my pennies to buy for Mom when I was only 7 years old. Elena didn't even look at the inscription on the bottom. She simply tossed it into a cardboard box labeled miscellaneous decor. The lack of reverence was a physical blow to my chest. I finally found my voice, a low tremor that cut through their frantic movements, asking them how they could possibly think of money while the bed upstairs was still unmade. Marcus didn't even turn around. He just muttered something about market volatility and settling debts, as if he were reading from a corporate ledger instead of mourning a parent. The atmosphere grew thick with a mounting tension, a darkness that seemed to seep out from the shadows of the corners. I realized then that their desperation wasn't just about greed, it was about fear. They were moving with a frantic, sweating urgency, looking over their shoulders as if they were afraid the walls themselves would start talking. As I followed Alina into the kitchen, I saw her trying to pry open a locked floorboard beneath the pantry, a spot our mother had always kept covered with a heavy braided rug. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized they weren't just looking for valuables to sell. They were searching for something specific, something Mom had hinted at in her final whispered days. There was a ledger, a record of a choice made decades ago that involved a sum of money that didn't belong to our family. The way Marcus's hands shook as he fumbled with his keys told me everything I needed to know. They weren't just mourning a loss, they were trying to bury a crime before I had the chance to uncover the truth. The betrayal I felt earlier was now evolving into a cold, hard resolve. They thought I was the weak one, the sentimental sister who would just weep in the corner while they dismantled our history, but they didn't realize that I knew exactly where the key was hidden, and I knew exactly what that ledger contained. The air in the kitchen felt heavy, suffocatingly still, as the realization dawned on me that my own flesh and blood would be willing to step over our mother's memory to ensure their own survival. The game they were playing was far more dangerous than a simple estate sale, and the stakes were nothing less than the truth of who we actually were. The frantic scratching of Alina's fingernails against the wooden floorboards sounded like a rodent trapped in the walls, a desperate and hollow noise that made my skin crawl. She didn't even look up when I stepped into the kitchen, her face flushed with a feverish intensity that I had never seen before. Marcus joined her, his expensive suit jacket discarded on the counter, sweat soaking through his shirt as he used a butter knife to wedge the gap in the wood. They were no longer the siblings I had shared holidays with. They looked like scavengers digging for bone. I stood in the doorway, my shadow stretching long across the linoleum, feeling a cold detachment settle over me. "It's not there, is it?" I asked, my voice flat and echoing in the sterile room. They both froze, Marcus's knuckles white around the handle of the knife. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the heavy, uneven breathing of two people who had let greed consume their humanity. Alina turned to me, her eyes narrowed and sharp, demanding to know if I had moved the black leather book Mom always kept nearby. She didn't ask about my heart or how I was holding up, she wanted the evidence. That book didn't contain bank accounts or stock certificates. It held the truth about the fire 30 years ago and the insurance payout that had built Marcus's first business and paid for Alina's tuition. Our mother had carried that guilt like a stone in her throat for 3 decades, and now, with her breath gone, my siblings were terrified the stone would finally drop. I watched them realize that I was the only thing standing between them and the exposure of a life built on a foundation of lies. Marcus took a step toward me, his stature meant to intimidate, his voice dropping to a low, threatening hiss as he told me to stay out of things I didn't understand. But he was wrong. I understood perfectly. I understood that they were willing to sell every memory, every photo, and every piece of our mother's legacy just to keep that black book from seeing the light of day. The house felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in as the tension reached a breaking point. They thought they could bully me into silence, but they forgot that I was the one who sat by Mom's bedside during those final, lucid hours. I was the one she trusted with the location of the real safe, the one hidden not in the floor, but in plain sight within the very grandfather clock they were planning to auction off by morning. The battle lines were drawn in that dusty kitchen, and as Marcus moved to grab my arm, I realized the siblings I once knew were dead, buried long ago under the weight of their own secrets. Marcus's grip on my arm was tight, a physical manifestation of the desperation rotting inside him, but I didn't flinch. I looked him directly in the eyes, seeing not a brother, but a man terrified of losing a lifestyle built on a lie. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and anxiety, telling me that we needed to be practical and that Mom would have wanted her children to be secure. It was a sickening justification for the theft of our family's integrity. Alina stood behind him, crossing her arms, her face a mask of cold calculation as she added that the house was already listed for a private sale and the movers would be there at dawn. They were moving with a surgical coldness, trying to outrun the ghost of their own guilt. I felt a surge of righteous anger, a heat that burned through the coldness of the house. They were so focused on the floorboards and the jewelry boxes that they hadn't even noticed the grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped ticking at the exact moment our mother drew her last breath. To them, it was just a piece of mahogany and brass to be sold to the highest bidder, but to me, it was a guardian of the truth. I pulled my arm away from Marcus with a sharp jerk, the silence of the room amplifying the sound of my movement. I walked past them into the hallway, the floorboards groaning under my feet as if the house itself were protesting their presence. I could hear them whispering behind me, plotting their next move, wondering how much I actually knew. They thought I was a sentimental fool who would protect the family name at all costs, but they didn't realize that the family name had already been tarnished the moment they decided to value gold over blood. As I reached the clock, I felt the weight of the small, rusted key hidden in my pocket, the key Mom had pressed into my palm with a final, desperate strength. She knew this moment would come. She knew that the greed she had fostered by protecting them for so long would eventually turn into a monster that would try to devour me. I stood before the tall, dark wood of the clock, listening to Marcus and Alina's footsteps approaching from the kitchen. They were coming to demand answers, to force me into their web of silence, but they were too late. The reveal was coming, and the inheritance they were so hungry for was about to become the very thing that dismantled their lives. Module 5, the shadow of Marcus, loomed over me as I stood before the grandfather clock, his reflection ghost-like against the polished glass. He demanded to know what I was hiding in my hand, his voice cracking with a jagged edge of panic. Alina was right behind him, her eyes darting to the clock face, then to me, realizing for the first time that I wasn't just grieving, I was guarding something. The air in the hallway turned freezing, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I felt the jagged teeth of the small key biting into my palm, a painful reminder of the burden Mom had left me. Marcus reached out to push me aside, his patience evaporated, replaced by a raw, ugly hunger. He muttered that he wouldn't let my sentimental nonsense ruin the deal he had already brokered with the developers. That was the final straw. He had already sold the land we played on as children before the grave was even dug. I turned to face them, my back against the dark wood of the clock, and for the first time, I didn't see my siblings. I saw two strangers who had traded their souls for a comfortable life. I told them that the house wasn't theirs to sell, and the silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it would crush the floorboards. Alina let out a sharp, mocking laugh, reminding me that the will left everything to be split 3 ways, and they held the majority. But she didn't know about the codicil. She didn't know about the confession tucked behind the swinging pendulum. My mother hadn't just left us furniture and property. She had left a record of the original sin that started their wealth, the truth about how our father's accidental death was anything but, and how the insurance money they were so proud of was stained with something darker than greed. I watched the color drain from Marcus's face as I slowly moved my hand toward the tiny, concealed lock on the side of the clock. They thought they were the predators in this house, but they were trapped in a cage of their own making, and I was about to turn the key. The tension in the hallway was a physical force, a storm brewing between the 3 of us that would leave nothing standing. As the key entered the lock with a metallic click that echoed like a gunshot, I saw the true terror in their eyes, the fear that the golden life they had built was about to turn into lead. The click of the lock seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the house, a small sound that carried the weight of a death sentence. Marcus froze, his hands suspended in midair, while Alina's breath hitched in a shallow, jagged gasp. I felt the door of the grandfather clock yield under my touch, swinging open to reveal the heavy brass pendulum that had remained motionless since Mom's heart stopped. Behind the swinging weight, tucked into a velvet-lined crevice, sat the black leather ledger, the Book of Ghosts. The atmosphere in the hallway shifted from tense to predatory. Marcus took a predatory step forward, his face contorted into a mask of desperation, his voice a low, dangerous growl as he demanded I hand it over. He claimed he was protecting me from things I couldn't handle, but we both knew he was only trying to protect the empire he had built on the ashes of our father's suspicious end. Elena's eyes were fixed on the ledger like a hawk on its prey. She knew that if the contents of that book were read by anyone outside this hallway, her high society life and her husband's political career would evaporate in an afternoon. I held the book against my chest, the cold leather feeling like ice against my skin. The betrayal I felt earlier had sharpened into a cold, hard clarity. They weren't just selling the furniture to be efficient. They were stripping the house to find this specific book and burn it before the lawyers arrived. They wanted to erase the evidence of the fire, the forged signatures, and the payoff that had silenced the investigators 30 years ago. I looked at my brother, a man who had grown rich off a tragedy he helped cover up, and my sister, who had spent her life pretending she didn't know where the money came from. The walls of the hallway seemed to lean in, the shadows of the ancestors watching from their frames as the three of us stood in a circle of broken trust. I told them that the time for secrets was over, and that every penny they had taken from Mom while she was alive was nothing compared to the price they were about to pay for their silence now. Marcus lunged, his fingers grazing the sleeve of my dress, but I stepped back into the shadows of the dining room, the ledger gripped tight. The hunt was no longer for a hidden treasure. It was a desperate scramble for survival in a house that was quickly becoming a prison of their own design. The air in the dining room was thick with the smell of old wood and the bitter scent of Marcus's sweat as he cornered me near the heavy oak table. His eyes were bloodshot, reflecting a man who had lost his grip on the narrative he had controlled for decades. Elena stood by the light switch, her hand hovering over it as if plunging us into darkness would somehow give them the advantage. They weren't acting like siblings anymore. They were acting like conspirators in a failing heist. Marcus hissed that I was being a martyr for a woman who was already gone, but his voice lacked conviction. It was fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. I opened the ledger just a crack, the yellowed pages crackling like dry bone, and the first thing I saw was our father's name written in Mom's frantic, shaky hand, dated 2 days after the factory fire. The entry wasn't about an accident. It was a timeline of a calculated choice. I looked up at Marcus and told him I saw the dates that proved he was at the warehouse when he claimed to be miles away at a friend's house. The color didn't just leave his face, he looked as though he had been struck. Elena's facade finally crumbled, and she began to sob, not out of grief, but out of the sheer panic of a woman seeing her gilded cage being dismantled piece by piece. She begged me to think of her children, our mother's grandchildren, using them as human shields to protect her own comfort. It was the ultimate disrespect to the woman lying in the funeral home. They had spent the last few hours treating Mom's life like a liquidation sale, and now they wanted to use her memory to guilt me into a cover-up. I realized in that moment that my silence had been their greatest asset, and they were terrified that the quiet Janet had finally found her voice. The house seemed to groan, a floorboard creaking upstairs as if a ghost were walking through the empty rooms, listening to our every word. I moved toward the front door, the ledger clutched so tightly my knuckles were white. Marcus blocked my path, his chest heaving, his shadow cast long and jagged against the wall by the dim hallway light. He told me I wasn't leaving the house with that book, and for a split second, I saw a flash of violence in his eyes that made my blood run cold. They were willing to do anything to keep the memory of our mother sold and buried, but they forgot that I was the one who had inherited her iron will. The violence in Marcus's eyes was a flicker of something ancient and ugly, a desperation that stripped away the last remnants of his expensive education and polished manners. He moved to block the exit, his heavy frame casting a shadow that swallowed the doorway, while Elena's sobbing turned into a sharp, panicked interrogation. She began to bargain, offering me a larger share of the house, more of the jewelry, and even a portion of her own inheritance if I would just hand over the book and let them burn it in the fireplace. It was pathetic to watch them try to put a price on a truth that was written in our father's blood. The more they offered, the more I realized how little they actually knew me. They thought everyone had a price because they had spent their entire lives being bought and sold. I stood my ground, the weight of the ledger feeling like a shield against their corruption. I reminded them that while they were busy tagging the furniture, I was the one who held Mom's hand as she struggled to breathe, listening to her beg for forgiveness for a secret she could no longer carry. She didn't want the money. She wanted the truth to set her soul free, and my siblings were trying to lock her back in a cage of lies even in death. The tension reached a fever pitch when Marcus lunged for the book, his fingers grazing the leather cover, but I pivoted behind the dining table, the heavy oak acting as a barricade between my conscience and their greed. The house felt alive with the ghosts of our past, the air vibrating with the unspoken words of a family built on a foundation of sand. I told them that the police would be interested in the names listed in the back of the ledger, the names of the men Marcus had paid to stay silent about the warehouse fire. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. Marcus stopped moving, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as the reality of his situation finally settled in. He wasn't just a grieving son or a greedy brother anymore. He was a man staring at the ruins of his own life. Elena collapsed into a chair, her head in her hands, realizing that no amount of money could buy back the security they had just incinerated with their own arrogance. I took a step toward the door, my heart hammering a rhythm of defiance against my ribs, knowing that once I crossed that threshold, the family I thought I had would be gone forever, replaced by the cold, hard justice our mother had finally found the courage to demand. The sound of Marcus's heavy breathing was the only thing filling the room as he realized his threats had no power over a heart that had already mourned him. He looked at the front door, then back at me, his eyes darting like a trapped animal searching for a hole in the fence. The house, once filled with the warmth of my mother's laughter, now felt like a cold, hollow vault where the walls were closing in on his lies. Elena looked up from her hands, her face streaked with tears that didn't move me. They were the tears of a woman who had lost her status, not her mother. She tried one last, desperate tactic, whispering that if I took that ledger to the authorities, I would be destroying the very name Mom worked so hard to keep respectable. It was a poisonous lie. Mom hadn't worked to keep the name respectable. She had worked to keep us safe from the truth of what my siblings had become. I told her that a name built on the bones of the truth is nothing but a monument to a crime. As I moved toward the hallway, Marcus stepped into my path again, but his shoulders were slumped, the fire of his aggression replaced by a chilling, cold calculation. He asked me if I really thought I could survive without them, reminding me of the legal fees and the scandals that would follow. He was trying to build a wall of fear around me, but he didn't realize that I had lived in the shadow of their secrets for 30 years, and I was finally stepping into the light. I gripped the ledger so hard my fingers went numb, feeling the texture of the old leather that held the power to shatter their world. I told him that I would rather be alone with the truth than surrounded by family members who were nothing more than well-dressed thieves. The grandfather clock in the hall gave a sudden, ghostly groan, the wood settling in the cold night air, sounding like a final gavel coming down on a trial. Marcus looked toward the clock, his face twisting in a moment of pure, unadulterated hatred for the inanimate object that had betrayed his hiding spot. He knew he couldn't stop me without committing another crime, and even he wasn't bold enough to do that in a house already visited by the coroner. I reached for the brass handle of the front door, the metal feeling freezing against my palm, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of their desperation behind me. I was leaving the house they had already sold, but I was taking the only thing that actually mattered with me. The cold night air rushed in as I cracked the front door, a sharp contrast to the stagnant, suffocating atmosphere of the house. Marcus didn't move to grab me this time. He stood paralyzed in the center of the hallway, a man watching his entire legacy dissolve like salt in the rain. Elena began to wail, a high, thin sound that echoed off the empty walls where she had already removed our mother's favorite paintings. Their greed had been so loud just an hour ago, but now it was a whimpering, pathetic thing. I looked back one last time at the hallway, at the outlines on the wallpaper where memories used to hang, and I realized that my siblings had been mourning the money long before they ever mourned the woman. They had sold her memory for a down payment on a life they didn't deserve, and now the ledger in my arms was the only thing that remained of the truth. Marcus finally spoke, his voice a hollow shell of its former authority, asking me where I would go. He thought his money was the only thing that kept me standing, but I told him that for the first time in 30 years, I was finally going home to a conscience that was clear. The betrayal was complete, but the justice was just beginning to stir. As I stepped onto the porch, the heavy door thudded shut behind me, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing like the final beat of a heart. I walked down the driveway, the gravel crunching under my feet, feeling the eyes of my siblings watching me from the darkened windows of a house that was no longer ours. They were left with the furniture, the silver, and the empty rooms, but I was carrying the fire that would eventually burn their house of cards to the ground. The streetlights flickered overhead as I reached the gate, the weight of the black book feeling lighter with every step I took away from their corruption. They had tried to sell our mother's soul, but they had forgotten that I was her daughter too, and I was the one who knew that some things are far too precious to ever have a price tag. The night was vast and silent, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was the one bringing the storm. The engine of my car hummed a lonely tune in the driveway as I sat behind the wheel, the black ledger resting on the passenger seat like a ticking time bomb. Through the windshield, I saw the front door of the house fly open once more. Marcus stumbled out onto the porch, his silhouette framed by the sickly yellow light of the foyer, looking less like a powerful businessman and more like a ghost haunted by his own reflection. He didn't come toward me. He simply stood there, watching the red glow of my taillights, knowing that with every inch I moved away, his carefully constructed world was fracturing. I could see Alina's shadow in the upstairs window, the room that used to be Mom's. She was likely already back to rummaging through the closets, hoping I had missed a second book, a second chance to bury the past, but there were no second chances tonight. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing through the pages I had glimpsed. It wasn't just about the money or the fire. It was about the systematic way they had manipulated our mother in her final years, tricking her into signing over property while she was clouded by medication and grief. They hadn't just sold her furniture. They had been selling her life piece by piece for years while I was away working 2 jobs to keep my own head above water. The betrayal cut deeper than a blade. I realized that the help they offered her was a slow-motion robbery, a predatory circling of a woman who only wanted to see her children united. As I pulled out onto the main road, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror, I felt a strange mixture of liberation and profound sorrow. I was the keeper of a terrible flame. I thought about the developers Marcus had mentioned, the ones waiting to tear down the lavender bushes and the porch where we used to sit and shell peas. They wanted to pave over the evidence of our existence, but the ledger contained names of people who were still alive, people who remembered the night the warehouse burned and the way our father's business partners suddenly disappeared from the ledger. The drive to my small apartment felt like a journey between 2 different universes. Behind me was the gilded cage of my siblings' lies, and ahead of me was the cold, hard reality of a legal battle that would likely leave me with nothing but my integrity. I knew that by tomorrow morning, Marcus would have his team of lawyers calling my phone, trying to bribe me, threaten me, or silence me. but as I looked at the ledger, I saw a smudge of my mother's thumbprint on the corner of a page, a silent plea from beyond the grave. I wasn't just her daughter anymore, I was her witness. And the testimony I was about to give would ensure that while they might keep the silver and the gold, they would never again be able to hide from the truth of what they had done to the woman who gave them life. The walls of my small apartment felt like they were vibrating with the secrets contained in that ledger, the air thick with a tension that didn't dissipate just because I had physically escaped the house. I sat at my kitchen table, the single overhead light casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on the yellowed pages that revealed a systematic betrayal far worse than I had imagined. It wasn't just Marcus and Alina. They had formed a pact of silence that involved forging medical records to make our mother appear incompetent months before she actually grew frail. They had been draining her accounts under the guise of estate planning, funneled through shell companies Marcus had set up in the dark. Every time I had called from across the country to check on her, and they told me she was sleeping or confused, they were actually sitting in her living room, directing movers to take the antiques or signing her name to documents that stripped her of her own legacy. I felt a cold, sharp stone of resentment harden in my chest as I read a letter tucked between the pages. A letter Mom had written to me but never mailed, detailing how she felt like a prisoner in her own home, watched by her own children like a target. She knew they were waiting for her heart to fail so they could pick the bones clean, and she had hidden this book as her only weapon to protect me, the child who didn't ask for a price tag on love. My phone began to vibrate on the table, the screen lighting up with Marcus's name, then Alina's, then a number I didn't recognize, likely the lawyers they had on speed dial. I didn't answer. I watched the phone crawl across the wood with every buzz, a digital manifestation of their panic. They were desperate to know if I had read the section about the offshore accounts, the ones used to hide the payout from the factory fire that had conveniently ended our father's life just as he was about to file for divorce and expose their mother's own secrets. The layers of the lie were shifting, revealing a family history that was more a criminal record than a lineage. I realized then that by keeping this book, I wasn't just fighting for an inheritance. I was fighting for the very soul of our family name, which had been dragged through the mud of greed for 30 years. I picked up a pen and began to make my own notes, a timeline of their crimes that I would hand to the district attorney at dawn. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, the quiet of the night amplified by the weight of what I was about to do. I was about to tear the mask off the respectable Janet family, and I knew that once the first thread was pulled, the entire tapestry of their lives would unravel until there was nothing left but the bare, ugly truth. The morning sun bled through my blinds like an uninvited guest, but I hadn't slept a wink. I had spent the entire night tracing the ink of my family's downfall. The ledger revealed a chilling detail I hadn't expected. A series of payments made to a private nurse who had disappeared from Mom's service only weeks before her passing. The notes in the margin, written in Mom's frantic hand, suggested that Marcus hadn't just been stealing her money. He had been manipulating her medication to keep her in a state of constant, foggy dependence. My blood ran cold as I realized the natural causes listed on her death certificate might have been a carefully orchestrated exit. Just as the weight of this realization hit me, a heavy pounding erupted at my apartment door, shaking the frame and shattering the morning silence. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know it was Marcus. His voice boomed through the wood, no longer pleading or bargaining, but sharp with a desperate authority, demanding that I open the door before things got ugly. He wasn't talking about family drama anymore. He was making a threat. I clutched the ledger to my chest, feeling the paper crinkle, a reminder that this small book was the only shield I had left. I heard Alina in the background, her voice high and hysterical, accusing me of being the one who was unstable and claiming they had already called the police to report that I had stolen a confused woman's legal documents. They were flipping the script, trying to paint me as the villain to discredit the truth before it could be told. I stood in the center of my kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs, realizing that the house they had stripped yesterday was just the beginning. Now they were coming to strip me of my sanity and my freedom. I looked at the back door, the small fire escape that led to the alleyway, knowing that if I stayed, I would be crushed by the machinery of their influence. Marcus kicked the door, the wood groaning, and for a moment I saw the same shadow of the man who had let the warehouse burn. He wasn't just my brother. He was a man who had built a life on silence, and he was willing to silence me to keep it. I grabbed my car keys and the ledger, moving with a silent, focused urgency toward the back exit. The betrayal had reached its final, most dangerous stage, where blood meant nothing and the only thing that mattered was who reached the courthouse first. As I slipped out into the cold morning air, I realized that my mother's memory wasn't just being sold. It was being used as a weapon, and I was the only one left to stop the hammer from falling. The iron stairs of the fire escape groaned under my weight, a metallic shriek that sounded like a warning to the quiet alleyway below. I could hear the front door of my apartment finally splintering under Marcus's rage, the sound of wood snapping followed by the heavy thud of boots hitting my floorboards. They were inside my sanctuary, tossing my life aside with the same cold efficiency they had used on Mom's house. I didn't look back. I threw myself into the driver's seat of my car just as Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs, his face a distorted mask of fury and fear. He shouted my name, but it wasn't the call of a brother. It was the roar of a predator seeing its prey slip through its claws. I floored the accelerator, the tires screaming against the pavement as I tore away from the curb, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. A black SUV, Marcus's car, peeled out moments later, weaving through morning traffic with a reckless desperation that proved he had everything to lose. The ledger sat heavy on my lap, a silent passenger that held the power to topple his entire empire. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel as I realized I couldn't just go to the local precinct. Marcus had spent years donating to the police balls and shaking hands with the commissioner. His influence was a web that stretched across the city. I needed someone outside his circle, someone who couldn't be bought by the Janet family legacy. I steered toward the federal building downtown, my heart racing in sync with the engine's roar. Every time I checked the mirror, the black SUV was there, closing the gap, a relentless shadow of the greed that had consumed my family. Elena was likely in the passenger seat, clutching her pearls and calculating the cost of my silence, while Marcus drove with a white-knuckled grip on a life built on a foundation of ash. I realized then that they weren't just chasing a book, they were chasing the personification of their own guilt. The city blurred past me, a gray wash of buildings and indifferent faces as I fought to keep the car steady. I wasn't just driving to a courthouse, I was driving toward a cliff. If I failed to get this evidence into the right hands, I wouldn't just lose my inheritance, I would lose my life to the accidental fate that had claimed my father. The tension in the car was a living thing, a suffocating heat that made the cold morning feel like a furnace. I saw the courthouse dome rising in the distance, a beacon of cold, impartial justice, and I prayed that for once, the truth would be louder than the sound of falling gold. The screech of my tires echoed against the marble facades of the federal district as I swerved into the restricted lane, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. In the rearview mirror, Marcus's SUV roared behind me, ignoring the sirens of a nearby patrol car that had finally noticed our high-speed pursuit. He didn't care about the law anymore. He was a man staring at the end of his world, and he was ready to burn everything down to stop me from reaching those courthouse steps. I slammed on the brakes in front of the main entrance, the scent of burning rubber filling the cabin, and I bolted from the car with the ledger clutched to my chest like a shield. I could hear Marcus's door fly open and the heavy thud of his boots hitting the pavement as he screamed for me to stop, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and a final, pathetic plea. He actually had the audacity to call out Janet, "We're family," While he reached for the collar of my coat, I didn't turn back. I ran toward the security checkpoint, my breath coming in jagged, freezing gasps. The lobby was a vast, echoing chamber of cold stone and indifferent light, and for a terrifying second, I felt like a small, insignificant bird flying into a gale. Two federal marshals stepped forward, their hands resting on their belts, their eyes locking onto the disheveled woman running toward them, and the man in the expensive suit charging through the revolving doors behind her. I didn't stop until I hit the wooden desk of the clerk's office, the ledger hitting the surface with a heavy, final thud that seemed to quiet the entire room. Marcus was stopped by the marshals just yards away, his face a sickly shade of purple, his hands raised in a fake gesture of concern as he tried to tell them I was mentally unstable and in possession of stolen property. But I wasn't the quiet, grieving daughter anymore. I looked him dead in the eye and told the officer that this book contained the evidence of a 30-year-old homicide and the systematic poisoning of a woman who was too kind to believe her own children were monsters. The silence that followed was the first real peace I had felt since my mother's heart stopped. Elena appeared in the doorway, her face pale and her expensive coat rumpled, and when she saw the marshal pick up the black book, she didn't scream or cry. She simply sat down on a bench and stared at the floor, realizing that the golden cage had finally collapsed. The betrayal had reached its peak, and as the officers led Marcus away for questioning, the weight of the world didn't lift. It just settled into a new, cold reality where the truth was finally more powerful than the money they had used to bury it. The fluorescent lights of the federal waiting room felt like a cold interrogation, stripping away the last of the shadows I had been hiding in. I sat on a hard plastic chair, my hands finally beginning to shake as the adrenaline ebbed away, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion in its wake. Across the room, separated by a glass partition and two armed guards, Marcus was pacing like a caged animal, his phone confiscated, and his influence neutralized for the first time in his life. He looked smaller somehow, the expensive fabric of his suit unable to hide the sagging posture of a man whose crimes were being cataloged by silent, efficient professionals in the back rooms. Elena was nowhere to be seen. She had been taken to a separate area, her silence finally broken by the crushing weight of the evidence I had delivered. A federal investigator emerged from the double doors, holding a photocopy of the ledger. The original was already sealed in an evidence bag, and the look on his face told me that the contents were even more damning than I had realized. He sat down across from me, his voice low and respectful, as he confirmed that the signatures on the medication logs didn't match the pharmacy's official records. My siblings hadn't just been greedy. They had been meticulous in their cruelty, ensuring that my mother's final months were a fog of confusion and fear so they could move their pieces across the board without resistance. The investigator told me that the names in the back of the book linked Marcus to a series of offshore accounts that had been flagged for money laundering years ago, but the trail had gone cold because no one had the key to the ledger. I had handed them the missing piece of a puzzle that spanned decades. I looked through the glass at my brother, and for a fleeting moment our eyes met. There was no remorse in his gaze, only a cold, calculating hatred that chilled me to the bone. He still thought he could buy his way out. He still thought the world operated on the same transactional level as his heart. But the house was sold, the money was frozen, and the mother he had treated like an obstacle was now the very person whose words would send him to a cell. The betrayal was no longer a family secret. It was a public record, and as the investigator asked me to begin my formal statement, I realized that the Aunt Janet they thought they could push around was the only one left standing among the ruins of our family name. The official recording device on the table hummed with a low, steady light, capturing the wreckage of my family's history as I spoke the truth into the cold air of the precinct. Each word felt like a stone being lifted from my chest, but the weight of the betrayal only grew heavier as the investigator revealed the depths of the depravity found in the final pages of the ledger. It wasn't just a theft of money. It was a theft of time. They had intercepted my letters to Mom for years, making her believe I had abandoned her in her frailty, while they whispered in her ear that I was only calling to ask about the will. The cruelty of it made the room spin. They had stripped her of the one thing more valuable than her estate, the knowledge that she was loved by at least one of her children. I watched through the observation glass as Marcus was finally handcuffed, his face a distorted mask of disbelief as the reality of his situation set in. The power he had wielded like a hammer was now a chain around his wrists. He shouted something about my disloyalty, his voice muffled by the thick glass, still trying to use the concept of family as a weapon even as he was led away. I realized then that to people like Marcus and Alina, loyalty was just a word they used to demand silence from their victims. As I signed the final page of my statement, the detective handed me a small plastic bag containing the item they had found in Alina's purse during her search. It was the ceramic bird I had given Mom as a child, the one Alina had tossed into a box like trash. She hadn't thrown it away, she had kept it, perhaps as a final trophy of the life she had dismantled, or perhaps because even in her hollow heart, there was a tiny, shriveled spark of the sister she used to be. I held the cold ceramic in my hand, feeling the jagged edge where it had been chipped in the chaos. The house was gone, the siblings I grew up with were criminals, and the fortune was a blood-stained illusion, but I had this. I had the truth, and I had the memory of a woman who, despite their best efforts, had managed to save her daughter from the dark. The building was quiet now, the frantic energy of the morning replaced by the somber reality of a family destroyed by its own hand. I stood up to leave, my legs feeling heavy but certain, knowing that the next time I saw my siblings, it would be across a courtroom where no amount of gold could shield them from the light of justice. The courtroom was as cold and silent as the house had been on that final afternoon, but the air here didn't smell of lavender. It smelled of old paper and the sterile finality of the law. I sat on the hard wooden bench, my eyes fixed forward, refusing to look at the defense table where Marcus and Alina sat flanked by a small army of expensive lawyers. They were still trying to play the part of the bereaved, dressed in somber black, their faces cast in a practiced mask of misunderstood innocence. But the masks were crumbling. The lead prosecutor began to read the transcripts from the black ledger, and as the words filled the room, the atmosphere turned suffocating. The jury listened to the cold, calculated logs of how my brother had diverted funds meant for my mother's care into offshore accounts, and how my sister had systematically cleared out the family safe while our mother lay in the next room, too sedated to notice the theft. The most devastating moment came when the private nurse I had discovered, the one who had been paid to disappear, took the stand. She testified under oath that Marcus had instructed her to increase the dosage of my mother's sedatives every time I called, specifically to ensure I would believe she was too confused to speak to me. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, a sound that felt like the final shattering of the Janet family name. I felt a cold chill wash over me as I realized the true extent of their darkness. They hadn't just been waiting for her to die, they had been actively erasing her presence while she was still breathing. Marcus tried to stare me down, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a silent promise of retribution, but for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely no fear. He was no longer the powerful older brother who held the keys to the kingdom. He was a man being exposed as a common thief and a cruel manipulator. Alina began to tremble, her composure finally breaking as the details of her forged signatures were projected onto a large screen for everyone to see. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for a mercy she had never shown our mother, but I remained as still as stone. The betrayal had been too deep, the lies too calculated, and the greed too absolute for any bridge to remain between us. As the judge called for a recess, the room erupted into a low murmur of shock, and I realized that the respectable life they had built was now nothing more than a pile of ash. They had sold our mother's memory to buy a throne of lies, and now they were watching as that throne was dismantled, piece by piece, in front of a world that would never forget what they had done. The judge's gavel struck the wood like a final heartbeat, a sound that signaled the end of the Janet family as the world knew it. The jury returned with a verdict that stripped Marcus and Alina of everything they had clawed for: their freedom, their assets, and the respectability they had used as a weapon. As the handcuffs clicked around their wrists once more, this time for the long walk to a federal cell, Marcus turned to me, his face a distorted mask of bile and resentment. He hissed that I had destroyed our legacy, that I had burned the house down just to feel the warmth of the fire. But I looked at him with a cold, unwavering clarity and told him that he was the one who lit the match the moment he placed a price tag on our mother's soul. I watched as the guards led them away, two people who had entered that house as vultures and were leaving it as ghosts of their own greed. The courthouse halls were empty as I walked out into the evening air, the sunset casting long, bleeding shadows across the stone steps. The fortune was gone, seized by the state to pay back the debts and the people they had swindled, and the family home had been reclaimed to be turned into a community memorial, just as Mom had secretly wished in the final pages of her book. I stood there feeling the weight of the ceramic bird in my pocket, the only physical piece of my childhood that remained. The betrayal was complete, but so was the justice. I had lost a brother and a sister, but I had regained my mother's voice, ensuring that her life wasn't just a series of transactions in a ledger, but a story of a woman who was loved. The silence of the city felt different now. It wasn't the suffocating silence of a secret, but the quiet peace of a truth finally told. I realized that my siblings hadn't just sold her memory. They had sold their own futures, trading a lifetime of love for a handful of silver that had turned to dust in their hands. As I walked toward my car, I felt the presence of my mother in the cool breeze, a soft whisper of gratitude that the cycle of lies had finally been broken. I was alone, but for the first time in 30 years, I was truly free. The dark chapter of the Janet family was closed, and though the scars remained, the light was finally mine to keep. The heavy iron gates of the cemetery groaned as I closed them behind me, leaving the cold, silent world of the dead to return to the living. The wind brushed against the fresh earth of my mother's final resting place, a modest plot far away from the grand, hollow monuments Marcus had planned to build with stolen money. I had buried her with nothing but her favorite lavender sachet and the truth she had fought so hard to leave behind. My siblings were now residents of stone-walled cells, their names scrubbed from the boards of the companies they had corrupted, and their faces forgotten by the high society circles they had once worshipped. They had wanted to sell her memory before she was even cold, but in the end they were the ones who became cold, forgotten shadows in the eyes of the law. I stood by my car, looking back at the quiet hills, realizing that the greatest inheritance I received wasn't the gold, the property, or the silver. It was the strength to stand alone in the light when everyone else chose the darkness of a lie. The house where we grew up is gone now, replaced by a garden for the elderly, a place where no one is a prisoner and every voice is heard. The ledger is locked away in a government archive, a silent witness to a greed that failed to consume the one thing it couldn't buy. A daughter's loyalty. I am Aunt Janet, and though I carry the scars of a family that turned into vultures, I walk with my head high, knowing that the truth is a fire that cleanses as much as it burns. My mother's memory is no longer for sale. It is a sacred, living thing that breathes through me every day I choose to be kind, every day I choose to be honest, and every day I refuse to let the shadow of their betrayal dim the light of my soul. The story is over, the debt is paid, and finally there is peace. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard if viewer found this story entrusting and he forgot to do so. Thank you.